Made It to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 15. Sarah versus Alexis. You fooled me! Sarah spat out each word with all the bitterness overflowing inside her. Her blue eyes were drowning in anger. Her chest was heaving up and down rapidly, and her jaws were clenched down on her cheeks as she stared at the woman before her. I trusted you! Sarah knew that Alexis wasn't an easy one to provoke to guilt, but she at least expected her to offer an apology, even if it wasn't genuine. The funny thing was, though, Alexis didn't look the least bit guilty. Her hand was digging into her hips as she leaned her weight on her right foot while the other hand was holding a tray filled with fruits. With an unnerving smile on her lips, she outstretched it to Sarah and rose her brow when Sarah only stared down at it without making any move to take it. An abrupt snort happened to leave Alexis's mouth a few seconds later. It seemed to Sarah like she was trying to hold it back but failed to do so. I was the one who trusted you, Sarah, she countered. How could you have done something like that? How long have you been working with rogues anyway? Was the sex slave thing just a disguise? Alexis threw a string of questions at her. Strangely, her voice was shaking with feigned emotions such as disappointment and despair, but her face held pure mockery and triumph. Sarah's jaw ticked. What kind of trick was she playing at? And then it occurred to her. Damon was in the house. She was making sure that she didn't slip up her game by saying and doing the wrong things. That realization made Sarah's stomach churn in disgust. She shouldn't have expected anything better from Alexis of all persons. She was even the person who had framed her when she first came here. It's a shame that she had allowed her to do so again. But Sarah was simply too gullible and kind to resist a desperate request. Those traits were what brought her to her doom half of the time. But as she looked at Alexis's cunning stare, Sarah made a silent promise not to trust her again. No matter what happened in the future and no matter how desperate she was, she would never trust her again. That was a promise she planned on keeping. From her understanding, Alexis was nothing more than a greedy woman who wanted anything and everything to be under her control. She'd do whatever it takes to get what she wants, even if that means putting the blame onto someone else. Currently, that thing she craved for and wanted more than everything else was Damon Callisto. She could have him for all Sarah cared. She had no reason to fight over someone who didn't want her from the get-go anyway. But that was just what she told herself. It wasn't exactly how she really felt. She had set aside her true feelings on the matter, though, and she had even given herself the excuse that the mate bond was playing with her head. Sarah had never lusted after a man before. Not that she remembered. All the new experiences she had since coming to Damon's home was simply a trick of the mate bond. If she ignored it, then she'd get over it sooner or later. Hopefully. If you want Damon so much, then you can have him. Doesn't matter to me anyway. Sarah clicked her tongue, looking her up and down as if she was the doormat she was currently standing on. Then, she turned and began to walk back inside. However, she stopped just as she was about to close the door. Damon was somewhere in the house right now, and he more than likely couldn't hear their conversation from wherever he was. So Sarah figured she could just show a little bit of insolence. Just this once. She couldn't possibly allow Alexis to walk away with a smile on her lips after doing her dirty. Twice. The least she could do was to enlighten her on how much of a bitch she was. With a deep breath, she spun on her heels and faced Alexis, looking her dead in the eye. Before I go, she took a step closer, one threatening step that managed to visibly break Alexis's composure. But Sarah didn't stop there. She reached her shackled hands upwards and grabbed her by the collar, pulling her down to her height so they were eye to eye. "I'll have you know that you're a stupid woman who doesn't know when to stop. I couldn't have imagined that you'd do something like this over a man who isn't even yours. If you had begged me a few times, I would have willingly allowed you to have him. But you stooped so low. I swear, I feel disgusted to even look at you." Alexis's eyes widened, her body going rigid under her hold. She was obviously intimidated, and that only boosted Sarah to dig deeper under her snake's skin. "But I hope you keep in mind that you're not his mate, nor will you ever be. So don't feel so high and mighty now that you have him to yourself, because you'll soon be discarded. Don't forget that." Sarah took a satisfied look at her dumbfounded expression before she released her clothes, turned on her heels, and walked back inside. She slammed the door behind her and headed back over to her spot on the floor. She felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off her chest. Perhaps she should do that more often, when Damon's not around. She sat huddled up in the corner for a few minutes, her mind dwelling on Alexis's satisfying facial expressions until Damon came back into the room. His eyes roamed around first before landing on her. He looked her up and down with a dark look on his face. Sarah was immediately intimidated. She hugged her knees to her chest and lowered her eyes. Then, unfortunately for her, Damon walked closer to her until his glistening black shoes was present in her line of vision. She tensed. "I thought I told you to get ready," he said, a hint of anger in his voice. Sarah's head jerked upwards, her eyes widening. She had totally forgotten about it. She cursed under her breath as she shuffled to her feet, fearing that Damon would punish her for being so forgetful. "I'll go get ready now." She rushed forward in the direction of the closet, but was pulled to a sudden stop when Damon gripped her waist. Tingles that had long been forgotten about stared at her wrist, then spread across her skin. The sensation was euphoric, one that she could only feel when in physical contact with Damon. It was still a mystery why his touch felt so extraordinarily good, but she still endorsed it and basked in its sweetness. But the feeling only lasted for so long. Damon ripped his hand from her wrist and took a step back, his eyes blinking as if he had just managed to get himself free from a daze. You could say Sarah's expression was a lot similar to his. Damon was the first to gather his sense of reasoning. His cold, angry stare came back at full force, and he spoke with such dominance that Sarah couldn't help but lower her head submissively. "You ignored my order, so you'll be wearing that which you have on. I'll take it that you won't let it happen again. Let's go!" And then he turned and walked away as if nothing had happened. But Sarah saw the way his shoulders tensed and his hands clenched at his sides. He was affected by their connection, just as much as she was. Made it to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 16. The Introduction Party. Sarah sat in the back seat of Damon's black sedan. She had absolutely nothing to do, so she busied herself by fiddling with the chains on her wrist, causing a rattling sound to disperse through the car. When they had gotten in a few minutes ago, Damon had made sure to scoot as far away from her as possible, even if that meant squeezing himself flush against the car door. He didn't want to touch her, not even a small graze. Sarah felt the urge to glare over at him, and she did, but only for a split second. Thankfully, she turned her face away before he could notice it. "Need I remind you that you should be on your best behavior?" Damon asked nonchalantly as he looked out the window. His sharp jawline was displayed openly, rays of sunlight occasionally meeting his skin from the spaces between the tree leaves. They were passing by a long line of green palm trees on both sides, and not a single car drove by them since they started their journey. Sarah wasn't sure what was so intriguing out there all along, but when he spoke just now and refrained from looking at her, she got the idea that he stared outside because he didn't want to see her. An uncontrolled stab of pain shot through her chest at the realization. She bit her lip and cursed under her breath as she mulled over how irritating the mate bond was. She had been doing that a lot lately ever since their little disagreement. And the problem wasn't just that he hated her, he also continuously treated her like a dog, just like he did a little while ago when he told her to be on her best behavior. But that was how Mr. Knack normally treated her, if not worse. Yet there was a vague difference between the two, one that Sarah couldn't really put her finger on. "You heard me. I expect you to leave a reply. You are, after all, my sex slave. I'm sure you've been trained thoroughly on how to address others, have you not?" Sarah shifted in her seat and stuffed her suddenly clammed hands between her legs. He hadn't addressed her as his sex slave since she had came here. Instead, he had said something about her being his to keep and protect. The walls he was constructing were stronger than when she first came. She could tell, and Sarah clearly understood why. "Yes, Alpha," she answered softly, keeping her eyes on her hands so that she didn't have to make eye contact. When his gaze left the view outside the window and directed towards the side of her face, she could feel it, and judging by its intensity, he wasn't very happy. "Then act like it. Why the hell are you rattling the chains? Do you take pleasure in annoying me?" Sarah jolted in her seat at the sudden loudness of his voice. "I'm sorry," she exclaimed. Her heightened nervousness made her make the mistake of glancing at him apologetically, but the deadly stare that greeted her forced her eyes to cast elsewhere immediately. "I'm sorry," she apologized again. But this time her mindlessly apology was for something as simple as meeting his stare. Damon noticed how quickly her blue eyes swept towards him, as well as how quickly they turned away. And he was now annoyed more than he was angry. "How many times do I need to tell you not to apologize for any and everything?" Sarah pursed her lips as she continued to fiddle with her fingers. There was an answer at the tip of her tongue, but her lips hadn't parted to let it free. This was one of the very rare moments where her mouth had not betrayed her, but Sarah was only able to keep it shut for so long. He made it quite clear a few seconds ago that she was his sex slave, and nothing more. He even told her to act more like one. And now he was telling her not to apologize for doing something wrong? That was going against his own words. This was confusing. He was confusing. "I am nothing but your sex slave. As you stated clearly, I was trained to apologize for every single thing I do that is deemed wrong by my owner," she started to say, making Damon's eyes slightly widen in surprise. She wasn't sure what brought the push of confidence, but she didn't even stammer through her words. "Plus, you told me moments ago to act like the sex slave I am, and so that is what I will do." Sarah's face still wasn't turned in his direction, so she didn't get to see the way her words made his eyes twitch. He was irritated, very much so, but he had nothing to say to that. What was there to say anyway when he had indeed told her to act more like a sex slave? But it made him so angry to hear her say it herself, and he had no idea why. Damon and Sarah had just arrived at Sumber Hall, the place where all the alphas of each pack and high-ranking werewolves gathered for their meetings as well as occasional celebrations. This particular occasion was supposed to be a simple introduction, then afterwards they would immediately leave. But surprisingly, Damon had come to see flashing lights, sleek cars, and countless werewolves in formal outfits running around in his vision. He was king, so he had wanted to look extravagant in his new tuxedo, more so than the people around him. But now that this was styled as a party, he didn't look as extravagant as he wanted. Well, he did outdo the others, but not to the extent he wanted. And that was all because of Jason Claw. Jason was the one whom he had entrusted the task of inviting all the high-ranking werewolves. There was no one other than him who would dare to irritate him by planning all this without his prior consent. Clicking his tongue in annoyance, Damon glanced around the area in search of him as he walked along the red carpet that led inside the tree-floored mansion in front of him. Sarah was closely trailing behind Damon, her shackled hands pressed against her chest as her eyes darted from left to right, then from right to left. Eyes followed her every movement, watching and analyzing everything from the way she walked to the filthy, torn-up clothes she was wearing. She was used to the eyes because of the frequent customers that came to the human trade branch she was at before. But this kind of stare was different. They were full-blown judging her solely by her appearance. There were even some devious-looking women who had glared hatefully in her direction. It wasn't just some plain hatred, though. It was a look that said, "Drop down and die right now before I kill you myself." Sarah shivered under their stare and picked up her speed so that she was just a few inches behind Damon. "Alpha!" A call from the left drew both of their gazes towards the man whom Damon had been searching for since he arrived, Jacob Claw. He was coming out of a blue car, wearing a blue suit with a blue tie, blue shoes, and white undershirt. Sarah scrunched up her nose at his obvious obsession with the color blue. "What the hell is this?" Damon seethed. Jason didn't look the least bit scared of Damon despite the anger in his tone. He simply walked forward and patted him on the shoulder. Then as soon as his eyes scanned his attire with an approving stare, he turned to Sarah and looked her up and down. "When Damon told me he wanted to introduce you today, I totally thought he forgot about the full moon tonight." He glanced down at the chains binding her hands together and smirked knowingly. "But it seems like you guys are already preparing for it." Sarah blinked. "Full moon? What's there to prepare for on a full moon?" Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 17. Full Moon. "Prepare for what?" She mumbled through her lips, still clutching her hands to her chest. Jason was a lot shorter than every other werewolf around. He was even an inch shorter than Sarah, and she was barely 5'4". The wind sent strands of his low, frazzled black hair in all directions, and his black eyes were small and naturally slitted. Despite how mischievous his appearance looked, he still gave off an amicable vibe. He was probably even the only one at the party who wasn't practically cursing her 6 feet under with their eyes. It's no wonder why she didn't feel uncomfortable in his presence. A loud smacking sound jerked Sarah out of her thoughts. Jason had smacked Damon on the arm and was now grinning like an idiot, that same knowing look on his face. "She's messing with me, right?" Damon didn't make any move to speak. He simply looked to be awfully surprised to a degree that didn't seem healthy. His face had drained of color and his whole body began to sweat. Sarah rose her brow slightly as she inevitably started to question what was so distressing about a stupid full moon. After taking in Damon's appearance, Jason gave him a look of utter disbelief. "You look like someone who's just realized that they fell face first in shit. "Dude, you seriously forgot?" he exclaimed, turning the remaining few heads in their direction. Then, with eyes as wide as saucers, he turned to Sarah and studied her expression. "And you," he said, pausing to take in a breath of fresh air. "You seem clueless. Completely and utterly clueless. But that can't be. Damon had to have told you about the awesome time both of you will be spending tonight. But if he really didn't tell you, which is really not a good move, then I suppose he wants you to have a heart attack tonight. I mean, you're human and he's a werewolf. You barely know anything." "Jason, shut up." Damon spoke in that same low and deadly tone of his that always sent chills down her spine. "Say another word and I'll make you swallow your own tongue." He was apparently looking at Jason as he spoke, but his eyes weren't focused on him. After he had heard about the full moon thing, he had went pale, completely pale and unfocused. That made Sarah wonder. The full moon was obviously important, but why? "Let's go." He jerked his head in Sarah's direction. She was about to jump into action, but Damon was too impatient to wait. He went to grip her arm, but then he thought against it and gripped a pinch of her clothing instead, dragging her behind him. Jason scoffed at Damon's obvious disinterest in him despite not having seen him for a long time. Maybe he shouldn't have mentioned anything about the moon. "Hey, wait up!" He rushed forward behind them anyway, and chuckled when he spotted Damon visibly pick up his pace. Sarah, on the other hand, was getting more and more overwhelmed by the second. Jason's weirdly fun personality, despite being a werewolf, was both astonishing and strange, and adding to that, this full moon thing was giving her a really bad feeling. She had never seen Damon so pale before, and he was acting quite differently from his usual grumpy mood. Him being this way now was what made Sarah's own dread rise as well. If Damon feared the full moon, then it was only logical that she feared it as well. After all, before now, she thought the big bad alpha didn't fear anything. So whatever this full moon signified or meant, definitely wasn't something good. Not in the slightest. The three of them walked on into the mansion with Damon pulling Sarah by her clothes, and Jason following closely behind them as he chatted about stuff regarding the meetings that had happened in Damon's absence. Damon wasn't listening to him, and neither was Sarah. Both of them barely even realized that he had been speaking. Damon's mind was solely on one thing and one thing alone. The full moon. "Damon, are you listening?" Jason frowned when he ran out of words and finally realized that nobody had been paying him much attention. "You know, I totally understand that you forgot about the full moon and all, but still, this is a joyous occasion. Show a little life, will you?" Damon still didn't acknowledge his presence. His frown deepened. "I bet you'll be energetic tonight when you and your mate over here gets cozy in the sheets." He grinned from ear to ear and wiggled his eyebrows suggestively as he tried to lighten the mood. After those words reached Damon's ears, Jason finally got a reaction out of him. Only it wasn't a good one. Damon stopped, released Sarah's clothes, then turned around to face him. His eyes. That was all it took for Jason to take the hint and shut his mouth. Though the stare wasn't directed at Sarah, she was still scared shitless. He looked like he was ready to massacre an army and munch on their skin and bones. What if she and Jason was a part of that unfortunate army? Thankfully, before either of them could shit their pants, Damon turned and began walking towards the podium up ahead. Jason let out a noisy sigh. What's the hell crawled up his ass and died? He stepped closer to Sarah as he rubbed his chest in an attempt to stabilize his breathing. Sarah took her eyes off Damon's back and turned to him. What? She clearly understood his words, but she thought it was not wise of her to badmouth anyone, especially not Damon. Never mind. Anyway, do you seriously not know what happens on a full moon? Sarah's interest immediately surfaced. The full moon talk doesn't seem to be leaving his mouth anytime soon, and plus, Damon was about 12 feet away getting ready to address his subjects. He more than likely wouldn't hear their conversation if she kept herself cautious. This was her perfect chance to get the answers she wanted. "No," she finally replied. "Is it like a D-Day or something like that?" "Seriously?" Jason immediately burst out laughing. Sarah blinked, her head tilted to the side as she tried to figure out what exactly was funny. "No, it's nothing like that." He managed to shake his head, squeezing his lips together to hold his laughter in. "But you could say that it's that one rare night when you'll be able to keep Damon in check." "What do you mean?" "Damon will bend to your will whether he likes it or not, so you'll be able to tell him what to do and what not to do. It's something that he cannot control on a full moon." Sarah's eyes widened. The full moon made him bend to her will? That explains why Damon reacted to it so dreadfully. Was it a perk of the mate bond that she didn't know about? If Jason was right, then for once, the mate bond would work in her favor. With that, she could even tell Damon to kick Alexis out tonight. What he does the next day would just be a consequence that she would have to face. But consequence or not, she'd pay back Alexis for doing this to her. How exactly can I control him? Is there like a command inputted into his brain on a full moon? Jason grinned, barely managing to drape an arm over her shoulder due to his shortness. All you have to do is refrain from giving him what he wants. It's that easy. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 18. Damon's Jealousy. Refrain from giving him what he wants? I don't understand. Sarah whispered to him, her eyes looking up at him in interest and eagerness. What exactly does he want? Well, you know, Jason smiled, intentionally withholding a direct answer to her question. What he wants is... He paused, gesturing with his hands for her to draw closer. Sarah cluelessly followed his instruction, inching closer to him with her ears perked and ready to receive whatever information he had to give. You! The word reverberated through her ears, followed by an equally loud laughter that belonged to none other than Jason. Sarah pulled away from him quickly and rubbed her ringing ear. What the hell's up with this guy? She asked herself, eyeing him suspiciously with narrowed eyes and raised eyebrows. Damon wants her? Ridiculous! Absolutely ridiculous. Damon has never and will never want her. And even if he did, in what way did he actually want her? To be his personal punching bag? To laze around and wait for him to show a little courtesy? Or maybe he wanted her to fulfill her duty as his sex slave? The thought popped into her head completely unannounced. Sarah's eyes widened and her soft cheeks heated up, a small tingling sensation spinning around in her gut, then relocating to her lower region. The sensation was incredibly new to her, but despite that, Sarah didn't let it destroy her mind completely. She pressed her legs closer together and shook her head vigorously, her shackled hands reaching down to pinch the upper part of her thigh, hard enough for the skin to break. Snap out of it, Sarah! What kind of foolishness was she talking about? How could such a thing even enter her innocent mind? Damon wasn't someone who she should get flustered over nor have high expectations of. He already made it pretty clear with his actions that he didn't want her at all. Not romantically, not sexually, not anything. So was Jason just making fun of her then? It seemed very much like that was the case since at the moment, Jason was laughing his head off like a crazy person. Perhaps she missed the joke? You're a funny one, aren't you? Jason commented with a grin, finally sobering up from his laughter. He was short, yet the weight of his hand on her shoulder was kind of weighing her down, but Sarah didn't mention it. And strangely, she didn't feel the least bit uncomfortable with their proximity. Jason seemed to be a natural when it came to friendly vibe. He's a lot different from Damon, she could tell. It's a wonder how someone friendly-looking and cheerful like him became close with Damon. And it's even more of a mystery as to how Damon had friends, considering his ruthlessness. Don't think too hard on it. I bet you'll like whatever the full moon has in store for you, he assured, moving his arm from her shoulder so he could pat her head. Anyway, I guess I can consider you a friend now since I spilled the beans, right? I get the feeling that you, Damon, and I will make a great trio. He beamed at her brightly. Sarah wasn't even sure what the word trio meant, but she didn't want to seem dumb, so she nodded slowly nonetheless. Great! So how about I tell you some hilarious jokes about your mate over there? He jerked his head in Damon's direction and finally took a glance over at him. But the hazel eyes that met his were totally different from the hazel eyes he had looked into not too long ago. These ones were deadly. Damon had been on stage for around 3 or 4 minutes. There were a few eyes on him while the majority was on Sarah. Despite knowing that he was supposed to address his subjects, Damon hadn't even opened his mouth to speak. Why? Well, because as soon as he got on stage and was ready to speak, his eyes had spotted Sarah and Jason getting cozy in the crowd. His right eye twitched. Who said Jason could touch what he already claimed and speak to her as if they had been friends for hundreds of freaking years? Not only that, who gave all these werewolves the authority to stare at his mate so openly? And in his presence at that? Yes, he had ordered her to come here in a dress that wasn't really presentable, but that was simply her punishment for making him angry. He hadn't thought of how many eyes would be able to see her. That didn't even come to mind. But that didn't mean that she was supposed to run around talking to guys she doesn't even know and letting him touch her. And the fact that he and Sarah had barely held something that could be considered a conversation made his blood boil. She could talk so casually with others, but not with him? As Damon ticked like a time bomb in his spot, he suddenly felt his wolf's presence dangling in his mind. It would take a lot of effort to hold him back, especially since the full moon was coming on, so Damon willingly allowed him to push forward. He could sense his wolf's anger as well, but what he didn't know was that his anger wasn't directed at Sarah. Instead, it was directed at him. Do you think you have the right to feel jealous? His wolf, Liam, asked. Damon stiffened, taken aback by his unexpected words. Jealous? That's not it. Liam growled thunderously, shutting him up at the moment he tried to defend himself. After watching her get hurt and chaining her up in your room, do you think she'll even consider you as a mate? Do you think your jealousy is justified when you've already stomped on your mate Bond? Don't make it worse than it already is, Damon. Just let her be. And with that, Liam retreated to the back of his mind. One would think their conversation had calmed him down a bit, but unfortunately, it had done the exact opposite. Damon knew very well that what Liam said was true, and that was exactly why his anger multiplied rather than depleted. Jason, on the other hand, had clearly seen the rage in Damon's eyes, and the reason behind it was quite obvious. Clearing his throat, Jason took 4 well-needed steps away from Sarah, all fun and jokes now thrown aside. Sarah's confused eyes moved over to him. Then, when she saw that his gaze was directed on something up ahead, she followed his gaze. And it was then that Sarah noticed it. The look Damon was giving them. It was a look of complete rage and something else, something that almost seemed like jealousy. But she didn't get much time to confirm whether she had truly seen it or not, because right after she looked at him, her name, suddenly echoed through the hall. "Sarah!" That icy, chilling voice belonged to Damon. No mistake about it. Sarah flinched, her feet unconsciously sliding backwards. She was clueless, utterly clueless as to what made him angry. Was this one of those times when he gets angry for no good reason? Or did she do something without realizing it? Whatever it was, she needed to find out and fast, because Damon looked like he wanted to bury her 6 feet under right now. "Yes, Alpha?" She twisted her legs together and began to fiddle with her fingers, while eyes watched her front and back, left and right. She lowered her eyes to the floor and awaited his command, trying hard not to make her poker face waver. "Get out!" It was then that she wavered and completely lost her composure. He wanted her to leave? Under any other circumstances, she wouldn't have questioned his command. But this was her welcoming party, was it not? How could he just kick her out? She stood in silent astonishment until Jason threw a whisper in her direction. "You should probably wait outside. He's just on edge because of the full moon." Sarah wasn't sure if he was right or not, but she'd go with that excuse for now, just so she could feel a little better. "He's simply on edge because of the full moon." She repeated the words in her head and nodded to herself. Then, without a word of objection, she turned and walked towards the exit. The eyes on her didn't ease up, but she didn't let that get to her. The fact of the matter was that she wasn't afraid of their eyes. Not at all. The only eyes she was truly afraid of were the hazel ones that belonged to Damon Callisto. Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 19. The Return of Kevin March. What kind of calamity struck again? Sarah asked herself as she stooped with her back against the wall and her head resting on her arm. Damon had chased her out of the party without any concerns as to how she would have felt. Yes, he shouted at her face, but this time there was a slight difference. They weren't alone. They were among dozens and dozens of werewolves. She had kept a straight face when she was walking out, yet still, there were series of snickers and whispers dispersed over the crowd. And don't forget those women who gave her the death glare. In Sarah's opinion, they seemed to be in close comparison with Alexis. Sarah sat in place, watching as the moonlight replaced that of the sun and lit the place with a dull illumination. She sighed for the umpteenth time since she had arrived outside. She was getting tired of sitting and waiting for Damon to cease his incessant talking inside. Her feet were aching and her whole body was beginning to cramp all over. Sarah couldn't help but think that he had forgotten that he left her outside, in the dark and cold night. Or perhaps he hadn't forgotten, he just didn't care. Sighing again, she lifted her head, then stretched her cramping arms before slowly rising to her feet. But as soon as she did so, the sound of footsteps approaching reached her ear. She stiffened in place, her head snapping left and right repeatedly. "Who's that?" The question echoed in her mind several times over. She had no idea what the answer to it was, but she felt the ambiance suddenly change to a spooky one, similar to the time when she had entered that basement. For a moment, she contemplated whether to run inside or stay and face whoever was approaching her, but she subsequently thought against the former when she remembered Damon's eyes. He would probably get extremely angry if she went back inside without his permission. And whoever this person was, he/she couldn't be more scarier than Damon. With that in mind, she stood there silently while her teeth gnawed at her nails in anticipation. Then out from the shadows came a man. When his legs stepped out from the darkness, she got a sudden feeling of déjà vu. It couldn't be that rogue, could it? he wouldn't have shown up here, right? At least not when Damon's inside. Then again, he is a lunatic. He can make the impossible possible. But when his face came into view, all her suspicions died. This man wasn't a rogue, and he wasn't a werewolf either. Her gut feeling told her so, along with the gun he had resting in his holster and the leather cloak he was wearing. The only persons who displayed guns so openly and wore cloaks everywhere were hunters, the fierce group that hunted and killed werewolves. Sarah pressed herself closer to the wall. What kind of hunter with common sense would show up alone at a party filled with werewolves? Sarah was both confused and skeptical. He didn't look like he came for the purpose of hurting her, yet he didn't look harmless either. He was around 6'2", probably an inch shorter than Damon. His body was bulky and he was also a blondie. A tough, no-nonsense looking dude. Sarah looked him up and down openly, a calculative glint in her eyes. They said big guys didn't have much common sense, and this strongly proved it. If he wasn't actually stupid like she thought, then he wouldn't have appeared here of all places, would he? There was no doubt that if Damon showed up now, he'd reap the life out of him in an instant. Werewolves didn't like humans, and humans didn't like werewolves. That's just how it is. But Damon is the Alpha King. This hunter guy would definitely lose the second he started a fight. Sarah didn't want to see how that fight would play out, and she certainly didn't want one of her kind to die when it could be helped. After all, they were brave enough to fight for the sake of humankind. The least she could do was to get him to run for his life. She swallowed the saliva that had accumulated in her mouth. There are werewolves inside. You need to get out of here before Sarah? The sound of her name escaped through his thin lips and sped into her ear, stopping her sentence. How do you... Sarah blinked as confusion resurfaced and her heartbeat sped up. Know my name? The hunter smiled, his lips looking almost non-existent since he stretched it across his face. I never imagined that you'd forget me so soon. He walked forward slowly, eyes holding what looked to be longing. But what he longed for wasn't quite clear to Sarah. I've been searching for you non-stop, and now I find you. With him. How exactly do you think I feel right now, Sarah? His smile dropped completely in between his words, and then he suddenly took a glance over at the mansion's entrance with a dark look in his eyes. But when he turned back to look at her, his expression completely diverted back to his beaming smile and crinkled eyes that danced with nothing, longing and happiness. Sarah shivered. The man before her wasn't anything normal. He looked and sounded like a psycho who had his eyes set on her. Nobody needed to tell Sarah that she had gotten herself in a lot of danger. I'm sorry, but you have the wrong person. I don't know you. I've never even seen you before. She tried to desperately help her case, while her eyes cautiously eyed his approaching figure. Don't worry. I'll get you out of this mess soon, he reassured her, ignoring her previous words completely. A world without werewolves. I'll make it happen, Sarah. Just like I promised. And then, we can live happily together, you and me. A world without werewolves. That particular part repeated in her head over and over, until her memory finally came flashing before her eyes. This man wasn't just a hunter. He was Kevin March, her childhood friend. Made It to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 20. The Full Moon's Trick. A few years ago, before she was captured by Mr. Knack, she had met a boy while roaming the streets. They both were homeless and had lost their parents, so they easily understood each other's pain. But there was another similarity between them. They hated werewolves. For Kevin, it was a lifelong and boundless hatred, a hatred that he pushed over the limit. A few months before he met Sarah, his sister had been captured and killed by an alpha werewolf. After having lost all his family to werewolves, his relentless hatred began to rouse. Meanwhile, for Sarah, her hatred was only temporary. She had also lost her parents in the same way, but as she grew, she came to realize that werewolves and humans were just two species that wanted to survive, and in order to do so, they had the unshakable mentality that they needed to fight against each other. Of course, she had some form of hatred towards Mr. Knack and his goons for what they had done to her, but that didn't mean she hated every single werewolf on the planet because of it. In short, their promise held no significance anymore. Yes, she was grateful that he remembered her and was striving to keep his word, but truthfully, she didn't care about something like that anymore. Kevin, she started shakily. She was shaking like a leaf, and her voice was barely even audible, but she was still ready to tell him that their promise meant nothing to her in the politest way possible. I don't think... I spent a really long time looking for you. When I got info on your whereabouts at that human trade place, you had already been taken in by that piece of shit. I swear, he's such a freaking eyesore. He paused to bite down on his bottom lip. Hard. I already told you a few years ago that if they ever managed to take you from me, I'd walk to the ends of the earth just to find you, and I'd blow off the heads of each and every werewolf I encounter while I'm at it. Your stupid mate will be one of those unfortunate ones, don't worry. He left his crazy talk hanging in the air like an unknown alien spaceship and brought one of his hands up to touch her face. Do you think I'd let you go this easily? You're mine, Sarah. Not his. Not anyone else's. With pursed lips, he glanced at the entrance with the same dark look as before. When his fingers touched her skin, Sarah flinched, her head jerking to the side so that her left cheek was pressed hard against the wall. His touch felt repulsive and uncomfortable. She had never once thought that their encounter after such a long time would be this way, but it was probably because of the strange way he was acting, as if he was obsessed with her. From what she could remember, he always followed behind her wherever she went, and whenever they met a new kid, he always chased them off, saying that they weren't a part of their little group. Despite that, Sarah never once thought that it was an obsession, but the way he was looking at her now made her skin itch. What are you doing? She stammered as she did her best to evade getting grazed by his fingers. But wherever or however she angled her head, his fingers followed. Then, without warning, he gripped her chin harshly and kept her head in place, his face drawing closer to her own. After everything is set in place, I'll come get you. You just need to hold on a little longer. I promise. She could almost hear him grinning. You know I keep all my promises, don't you? Sarah's eyebrows drew closer together, and she could feel the soft drizzle of sweat on her forehead. With her heart beating a mile a minute due to their frightened state, Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and stiffened in place, waiting dreadfully for him to do his worst. But his worst never came. Instead, she felt wind hit her skin as if he had moved away from her very quickly, and then following that, she heard the sound of the front door being pulled open. Sarah quickly snapped her eyes open. The face she expected to see was no longer there. There were no signs of him. The only thing she could see were the dark trees from the forest and the long line of werewolves who had begun filing out of the mansion. Sarah finally let out a long breath. She had never been so glad to see werewolves in her life. Most of them were giving her weird looks because she was trying to catch her breath, but she didn't mind. In fact, she was happy that they were watching her. That way, she'd feel the least bit safe from him. "Sarah?" A call came from her left. She turned to see that Jason had stopped on his way out, his lips pulling upwards at each side. "Damon's calling you." Sarah's face went pale at his words, and Jason noticed it. "Don't worry," he said. "You just need to do what I told you and everything will be fine." He looked at his watch for a brief second, then looked back up at her, his smile visibly broader than before. "It's about time that he takes control. You should go in. But be prepared to meet the goofiest Damon ever." He left those confusing words with her, then carried on his way into the forest. Sarah couldn't help but frown at the fact that everything he sprouted out of his mouth was highly confusing. She hadn't even gotten the chance to fully shake off Kevin's creepy appearance, yet another problem already arisen. She had been complaining about Damon leaving her outside, but now that he called her in, she was hesitant to go. What did Jason mean by goofy anyway? There's no way Damon could ever be goofy, not even in his sleep. Perhaps Jason had misspoke, or was he making fun of her? Sarah stood in place for over 5 minutes, doing her best to stall by watching every single werewolf who came out of the mansion up until they entered the woods and were out of sight. When they were all gone, she still didn't make any move to go inside. Damon was extremely angry when he chased her out, so wasn't it likely that he's even angrier now? He was probably going to shout at her again. The good thing about it, though, was that he called her inside when no one's around. If only he had been so considerate a few moments ago when he practically disgraced her in front of his subjects. Sighing, she fiddled with her fingers and occasionally scratched her scalp harshly with her cracked fingernails. If anyone were to see her now, they'd easily be able to tell that she was overrun with agitation. Staying outside wasn't really favorable at all, since it was cold and the darkness gave her the creeps, but it was better than going inside. Back there, Damon seemed like he had a good amount of potential to break her bones and dig her eyes out, but stalling probably won't help. It's a matter of time before he comes and forcefully drags her inside, maybe by the hair, maybe by her feet. Or maybe he'd dig his fingers into the sockets of her eyes and haul her. Sarah shivered at the thought. But what could she do? There was no solution that would help. Then, like whooshing wind, the perfect solution swung her way. Damon had sent her outside for more than an hour. So why was she just now thinking of running away? Right now was her perfect chance, a once-in-a-lifetime. If she ran away, she wouldn't have to face the big bad alpha, and neither would she be plagued by their stupid mate bond anymore. But there were 2 questions that kept her from running off into the forest. Would Damon chase after her? And if he found her, would he kill her? Where would she run to? Her parents already died, and there are also hundreds of werewolves roaming around the country. Werewolves like Mr. Knack. They'd capture her without a second thought and sell her to whoever is willing to buy. So far, despite Damon's temper and harsh treatments, he was still the nicest werewolf she had met. He offered her food and shelter, and he hadn't even laid a finger on her. Yet. And plus, she had Kevin to worry about. What if he happens to catch her on the streets? The psychotic look in his eyes told her that their encounter wouldn't be very pretty. Sarah took a deep breath to calm herself and pulled her shackled hands to her chest before moving to sit on the floor, but the furthest she got was to stoop a little. A warm hand grasped her arm and tingles instantly started to spread. Sarah was scared, partly. Yet the tingles on her skin still managed to mess with her head. The euphoric feeling she felt when they touched was always hard to control, but this time, it seemed to be more intense, more sensual. And for some reason, she felt as if her heart had relocated to her lower region and was pumping fire into its depths. On the other hand, Damon was too agitated to notice her sudden arousal. "Sarah?" he called after a while of just standing there with his lips parted and his chest heaving. Sarah wasn't planning on turning her head in his direction, but it was the tone of his voice that made her glance at him. He didn't sound angry, and he didn't sound annoyed either. His voice sounded desperate, almost as if he was in a panic. When Sarah finally looked at him, the first thing she noticed before anything else was that his eyes were constantly shifting from hazel to golden, and from golden to hazel. It wasn't the first time she saw his eyes flash golden, so the occurrence only mildly astonished her. But what completely overwhelmed her with surprise was the fact that he was looking her up and down with eyes that held nothing but desire and a tinge of panic. Sarah's eyes bulged and she unconsciously twisted her short legs together, the heat between them impossible to ignore no matter how hard she tried. It was the first time she had seen Damon look at her like that, and also the first time he had moved his gaze from her face while they were speaking. Sarah dropped her eyes to the floor, numerous questions floating around in her head. What is this? A trick of the full moon? Or a once-in-a-full-moon occurrence? Mated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Written by Ba Room. Narrated by Dante Mohammed. Chapter 21. Fuel to the Fire. What is this? A trick of the full moon? Or a once-in-a-full-moon occurrence? Sarah's stomach did little flips, and her soft cheeks flooded over with red. It was an odd feeling. A feeling of both arousal and embarrassment. She was always naturally nervous and scared all the time, but she wasn't one to blush so furiously, nor get aroused over something as trivial as physical contact. The sensations that were corrupting her body, mind, and soul were fairly new to her. Another addition to the list of strange things that derived from meeting Damon. Yet, she couldn't deny that it was exhilarating and exciting. Back when Mr. Knack forced himself onto her, the only emotions she felt were disgust and hatred. The both of them made her feel totally different things, but there wasn't much difference between them, behavior and personality-wise. They were both devils among humans and werewolves. They didn't care about someone as trivial as her. And the only thing they wanted was to bring misery into her life. So it wasn't that they were different from each other. It was just that the mate bond was making her feel the way she did. While being stuck in their thoughts, both Sarah and Damon had been staring at each other for nearly a whole minute. They were equally affected, but Damon was the first to snap out of the full moon's trap. Truthfully, he desired her greatly. Far greater than he thought he would. But with years of experience with holding back his emotions, he managed to keep his desires at bay, especially after knowing of her betrayal. But now that they were stuck underneath the full moon, his restraints were weakening, and soon he'd be devoured by his desires. He needed to get out of this place ASAP. And he also needed to lock Sarah as far away as possible, somewhere he wouldn't be able to touch her. If they stayed here in this same position any longer, he didn't know what he'd do. He was barely able to hold himself back as it was. They needed to be apart from each other, at least until the full moon passed. Otherwise, he'd lose himself very soon. Or, in other words, he'd mark her and bound himself to her forever without being able to reject her as his mate. With the full moon at its worst, He doubted Sarah would even resist him if he tried marking her now. But tomorrow, when they're completely in control of themselves, she will definitely regret it. It wasn't that he cared how she'd feel later on. He just thought that it would just be better for both of them if that didn't happen. At least until he finally figures out her true intentions. "When you get inside," Damon finally started to say as he slipped his hand down her arm and gripped her wrist, just above the chains. His other hand dug into the chest pocket of his blazer and fished out a small key. While keeping her hands in place, he opened the lock on the chains and unfurled it from around her wrist before letting it fall to the floor. "Don't open the door for anyone, no matter how much I beg you to. Do not open the door." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes glossed over with confusion. She noticed that the interval lessened between the time when his eyes shifted to gold and the time when they shifted back to hazel. Worrying was inevitable. Last time when his eyes shifted to gold, it was because of his anger. This time, it seemed as if something else was the cause. Something was off about him. She was sure of it. He seemed too disheveled and distracted. He took off the chains for no reason at all, and what's even more suspicious was that he said something about not opening the door. Which door was he talking about, and what did he mean? Was he going to lock her up? Then Sarah thought, could it be that Jason was right about the controlling Damon thing? Once that thought popped into her head, Sarah immediately found it plausible. He seemed ruffled by something, so perhaps he's afraid that she'd put him at a disadvantage because she was able to control him since it was a full moon? And as for locking her away, was he doing that because he didn't want to fall victim to the effects of the moon? Before she could finalize her suspicions, Damon cut her pondering short by gripping her arm once again and beginning to haul a confused Sarah through the hall, then up the stairs. Sarah didn't put up much of a fight, though, as she knew for a fact that she was not his match. The only signs of protest were the few times when she tried to jerk her hand out of his hold, but to no avail. Where are we going?" she stammered, her eyes glued to the tingling spot where their skin touched. She could feel that same sensation down below, but she did her best to not let it show. Though if one took a good look at her wide eyes, flushed cheeks, and sweating forehead, they'd know for sure. "If you do not want this mate thing to get any worse, you need to be as far away from me as possible. Trust me," he answered, rushing through his words as he breathed in and out rapidly. Knowing Damon, Sarah didn't expect a response, so she was naturally taken aback when she heard his words, especially since she didn't understand a thing he was saying. Trust him? Why would she trust him when he had lied about not being able to hurt her? And when she first arrived, he even acted as if he was interested in her, when he actually wasn't. Not one bit. Sarah frowned, but didn't say anything. She allowed him to pull her to the top of the stairs, then towards the first room on the right. Without any further explanations, he pulled the door open and immediately pushed her inside. From what Sarah could tell, he was certainly impatient to lock her away for some reason. And even when he shoved her inside, he made it his task to avoid eye contact. Something is seriously wrong with him. Someone like him couldn't be so afraid of her controlling him for a couple of hours at most. Maybe something else was bothering him. Something more worse than what she expected. Sighing softly, Sarah stepped back a bit so he could fully close the door without it hitting her. There was no use in resisting Damon anyway. Damon took a brief look up and down her body. Then he closed the door from the outside and spoke. "Lock it from the—" Sarah rose her brow, pushing herself a little closer to the door. He was about to say something, wasn't he? Why did he stop talking? Sticking her ears to the door, she listened for any sound of him leaving, but she didn't hear a thing. It was only right to assume that he was still at the door. Is he standing guard? She mumbled, though she wasn't entirely sure. It was silent for a whole minute until she suddenly heard a loud growl, one that didn't sound human, more like an animal. Following the growl, she heard the knob twisting. Sarah immediately stepped away and straightened herself up so that she looked as though she wasn't trying to hear what was going on outside. She watched as the door creaked open slowly, expecting to see an impassive Damon looking down at her. But what she didn't expect was to spot Damon smiling from ear to ear, with his eyes completely golden. "Hello, little mate,"